All right, hey everyone, and welcome to this clay tea bowl demonstration video. Justin here. I appreciate you guys and your interest in Welcome to Clay, and I'm excited for all the fun we're gonna have. So what we've got here is a slab that's been rolled out on canvas to a 1/4 inch thick, and I'm using a flexible steel rib to smooth it out. This face that I'm smoothing out here is going to become the inside of the mug, so we want that to be nice and smooth. Now I'm using a template, and I'm making sure we have enough space to get 2 rectangles out of here, because we are going to be making 2 tea bowls. And that rectangle shape is going to become the body cylinder of our tea bowl. Just got a couple more spots I had to have smoother apparently. That must be good enough. Whoop, maybe not. Okay, there we go. Oh, Justin. All right, where should we get this first one cut out? Right there? No, let's get it straighter than that. Boom. All right, we're gonna use a little clay cutting knife here. Doesn't really have a sharp edge, but it does score through the clay really nice. And I'm essentially tracing this rectangle. These tea bowls that we're making are 3 pieces, 1 rectangle for the body. Once we get that cylinder created, we trace out a circle for the bottom to close up that cylinder so it'll hold our tea. And then we basically make a little ringed foot for the 3rd piece. So it has a nice little shape, it sort of floats off the table. If anybody really wants to put a handle on their tea bowl, that's all right, but I do kind of think this is going to be more of a Japanese style inspired tea set. And it's also really nice to drink a cup of tea from a tea bowl if you've never done it before. So I've cut out my rectangle and I've moved it to our little banding wheel, which is essentially a nice little lazy Susan tool for spinning work and being able to manipulate it. I'm going to turn that rectangle up on end. Now what I'm going to do is called score. And I'm going to use a needle tool here to essentially just put a bunch of little strikes and scores in the edge of this. And here I thought, oh, I'll get it closer so they can see, but really the camera just focused on my hand. But you can still see that the needle tool, I'm essentially just etching and scoring up that edge to get it nice and roughed up. This process is called slipping and scoring, and it's essentially how you combine 2 clay surfaces together. That little gravity check there, gravity's real, my piece fell over. Excuse me. Just scoring up the other side here. And because this clay is soft, still very workable, we're only going to need a little bit of water to stick these 2 pieces together. If the clay was leather hard, which is quite a bit firmer and harder to kind of squish and push around, we would want to use slip, which is essentially a very wet pudding-like clay, and we use that similar to mortar to stick a couple bricks together. But here we're just going to use a little wet sponge, dampen that edge up. I squeeze some water out, and here I get a little more than necessary on the banding wheel. If the wheel gets wet, then the clay tries to stick to it, and that can be a little frustrating. So now I'm essentially sticking these 2 edges together, getting them nice and lined up. I'm just using some pressure to squeeze those clay faces together. And make that seam as nice as possible. You can see there's a little chunk of clay that I must have picked up on my canvas there, but using a little bit of water just to simply add a little bit more lubrication where I'm smoothing out that surface, and taking a little time to try and grab a chunk of clay here and smooth out that little hard piece I picked up just to fill the surface out. One thing to keep in mind with these tea bowls and kind of the Japanese style philosophy when you're making a tea set, lots of things are inspired by nature, and we know that trees in particular and most plants don't grow in a perfectly cylinder shape, so it's okay if these bowls we're making aren't perfect. You know, they're not perfect, we're not perfect, and really the only goal is that they need to hold a nice cup of tea. So here I'm using my finger to go back and forth over that seam and smooth it out on the inside. I'm kind of using my hands to cup it and push it around a little to maybe make it a little bit more round, but it's certainly not perfect, and that's just fine. And from all that manipulation, my edge here kind of opened up a little bit on the front, so I'm just going to grab that metal ribbing tool and just use it to kind of pull the clay over and smooth it out real nice and just keep that seam nice and fresh. Now I'm going to flip it over, kind of do the same thing on that bottom edge where I couldn't reach so well before. Kind of make sure that I can still keep in my circle a little bit. I'm just using my thumbs and my forefingers to kind of squeeze that clay together where it was harder to reach at the bottom before it got flipped over. There we go, we made a cylinder. That's going to be the body of our tea bowl. I'm going to move that off the banding wheel here. Cut off a little chunk of slab and get ready to make the bottom of our tea bowl. So here we got that chunk of slab. Just going to make sure I got it nice and smooth in that one spot. Pull a little clay off my ribbing tool. Now what we're going to do is place our cylinder on that flat slab and simply trace it. And what we're doing is making a circle essentially to attach to the bottom of that cylinder to make a vessel that will then hold liquid. So here we got that circle. I'm just kind of using my tool here. I thought, oh, I better get that out of the way because they probably can't see. Just going to use the banding wheel again because it's just kind of easy to keep your hand in one position, and I know I messed up and put it out of frame here, but what I'm doing is using that needle tool as I slowly spin and basically move it back and forth to scratch up that edge of that cylinder, and you'll be able to see what that looks like in just a moment here. This is the first kind of video I've made like this. Maybe in the future I'll figure out how to fast forward here. Make it go zoom zoom. And now what you can see is I'm essentially just doing that same scoring just around that outside edge that I know is going to come in contact with the with the cylinder, excuse me. Make it all the way around, scratch it up real nice. Make lots of little spaces for that water to touch, and essentially that makes the little spot where the faces touch a little wetter, and through osmosis the liquid kind of travels through the spaces of the clay and hydrates that area and turns it all into the same consistency. So there's kind of a close-up of the scratching I did in preparation for cutting that out. I'm using a needle tool this time, which just works very similar to that knife for cutting through the clay. Really, whichever you prefer, it doesn't matter too much. That's one great thing with working with clay, is if You know, there are many different ways to complete the same objective, and if you make a mistake, you can smooth it right out usually. A lot of forgiveness and learning and working with clay. And so here I would be careful to very carefully not put too much water on here. When we put too much water on the clay, it likes to soak it up really fast, and it can become softer and a little less rigid. And when we put this bottom on this tea bowl, we really do want it to have a little bit of rigidity to it, because then it's going to be a nice flat bottom. And you'll see here, just because of the moisture of the clay and the amount of time that I made this in the video, we do get a little bit of sagging, but fortunately that's not even an issue, because we can simply push it back and let it dry upside down. But what we're doing here is putting those two faces together. I'm tapping around the rim there just to put some pressure into that seam. And you can kind of see that I did put too much water on the banding wheel here. And that's what I mean, that clay will be very appreciative to soak that up and become super slippery. So I would probably instead, we'll just use our fingertip or squeeze as much water out of that sponge and just go around with a small amount. And you can't quite see it, but I've turned it. And I'm like, oh gosh, I have too much water. Let's get that out of there. Now we flipped it over, and I'm gonna work on smoothing out that seam. Oop. Yeah, that's what I mean. Not perfect. Very few things are a perfect circle. I know there's a famous Da Vinci sketch of a circle, because he thought, oh, well, no one can draw a perfect circle, but I did. But we don't see a perfect circle in nature very much. All right, so I've gone around and smoothed that edge out. It really is convenient to be able to work with the banding wheel and try and center it up here, get some water on there. And really, one of the smoothest tools we have when it comes to working with clay and changing that surface texture is our fingertips. A little bit of water and a little bit of friction, and that's how people have been working with clay for thousands of years, which is actually pretty cool. This is an ancient technology officially that was a huge part of human evolution. And now you can see that we've got that inside edge there that just needs a little bit of cleaning up. So what I'm gonna do is use one of our little wooden shaping sticks here. Which edge should I use? I think I like that more blunt one. I'm just gonna move it to the center again, because that can be really convenient, or as close as I can to the center. And I'm just putting some pressure into that corner. Anybody who's ever baked or frosted a cake, or perhaps done any masonry or sheetrock work, maybe I'm just the only weirdo Justin of all trades in the room, but you'll probably relate a little bit to this process. And now I'm just using that smooth fingertip to push that into the corner as well, and smooth out that inside edge nice. Use my other finger and go the other way. I'm right-handed, so this feels funny doing it with my left hand, and of course I have to go back and do it the way that feels normal. Now, because I had that extra water on there, I've pushed the bottom of my tea bowl, and it's trying to stick. Excuse me. So here I've squeezed as much water as possible out of my sponge, and now I'm pushing that as kind of the final smooth. It is really important to try our best to get the interior as smooth as possible, because ultimately we want this to be a food safe container, and so that won't have any, little bumps or bips in it, because we would want to be able to clean that out. And so because of that extra water I mentioned, my tea bowl here is stuck to the bed of it, and I ended up bumping a little chunk out of it there. So I end up taking a little spot of clay and patching that up real quick and smoothing it out. And that's what I mean. So you make a mistake and you change the shape in a way you didn't mean to. It's really quite simple to, slip and score another little piece on there, bop it on and smooth that out. Again, I'm doing that right at the top of the frame. I'm sorry, folks, that's not too easy to view, but just got a little squeezed out piece of clay and a little triangle shape where that, when I popped it off the bat, it sort of stretched the clay and made a little funky divot. So I wanted to take a moment and fix that. And that's okay. Can't expect ourselves to do this perfect the first time. I know I certainly had a little rust to knock off. Because I know that I made my bat a little wet and stuff stick in there, I'm going to use my template just to kind of create a little extra space. And try and flatten that bottom out nice again. But hey, look at that. Little upside down cylinder. Now I've got that pretty close to centered on the wheel, and what I'm going to do here is just hold the needle tool in one position, almost like the needle on a record player, and then just slowly touch it to the clay. And while I spin that, you can see it's creating a nice little circle for me there. And so that's where I'm going to then put another little larger circle here, and that's creating the space that I'm going to then score, and then we'll put a little foot on this T-bowl so that it kind of floats a little bit, has a little character. So I'm just using that needle tool, scratch that surface up nice. All right, now in preparation to cut that little foot ring, it's basically going to be a little strip of clay that we trim off of here. And so first, it's only about a 1/2 inch wide. I'm just going to make a nice clean edge and then square off along, about, like I said, about a 1/2 inch thick rectangle. And then we're going to use that and get this chunky clay out of here. Bring our banding wheel back in. All right, we just kind of set that in place at first so we can trim it to the right size. And you can see, we're going to have some overlap here, and that's where we just take our needle tool. Hey, your hand's in the way. Can't see up there, dude. But what I'm doing is trimming those edges so that we can create a little ring that's essentially the same size of that little ring that we just etched in the bottom of the T-bowl. So now, like we've done with all of our clay-to-clay connections, we are scoring those up. Got a little water on my finger. I'm just squeezing them together, rounding out that ring. Flip it over, do the same thing. Here's an example of using that banding tool to spin with clay, and I can keep my hand in a nice comfortable position. So I don't have to worry about picking the clay up and turning it and picking the clay up and turning it. It really is a nice little lazy Susan to work on our projects. And because we are going to be making 2 T-bowls, it would be just fine to do that first step where we put the bottom on that cylinder twice and then do 2 of these foot rings. it's all right to do both steps at once for both, and there could be a little bit of advantage to that in letting the bottom firm up a bit, but we'll be able to make it work either way. And here's another moment where I used a little too much water, but it's gonna be okay. And I'm just going around and tapping that on. I'm beginning to smooth out that seam where the foot meets the bottom that we attached. You can even see the extra water squeezing out there. Because we have a pretty soft clay, we really just need a light amount of water to fix those surfaces together. In some instances, and if you're careful, you can really just push the clay together if you've got nice soft clay. And if we had what was called leather hard clay, which I'll show you all, and two pieces that were leather hard, like I said, we would use slip, which is just like a very soft pudding wet clay, to simply stick those two pieces together. And here, as I mentioned, my bottom was a little soft and I didn't want to put any downward pressure on it so that it didn't start to sag. But even if I had, clay stretches and it moves, and I'm able to adjust it as we go. So now I'm just flipping it over and checking that bottom, and I can see there that it did. You can't quite see it in the video, I'm moving too quick, but it's not as flat as I'd like it to be. And that's just, evidence that I pushed down when I was attaching that foot. And that's where maybe we can wait to attach our feet. Perhaps, even just a half an hour of time for that bottom to dry out. Clay is constantly pushing the moisture in it out into the air, and that's how it dries out. Here I grab a sponge to just work on smoothing out that seam. Doing some more tapping. There you can see the foot actually sticks to my finger, wiggles up a little bit on that tap, and it's just more evidence that that bottom is a little wetter than it wants to be. So I'm just using this nice tipped tool. It's got a couple of round ellipsis sort of edges. I can kind of push right in there, and if that clay edge wants to sag on me a little bit, all right, we're just gonna work into that, lean into it, and kind of make that bottom even have a little bit of an ellipse shape to it, so we can, hey, let the clay do what it wants to do. Working our way around the piece. And using that fingertip again to smooth the inside out. And we don't have to worry about this texture being perfectly smooth here right after attachment. We want to really get that seam pushed together immediately, but we've got time to work on, those little marks. The clay is going to stay in a workable texture for quite a while, and we've got wet boxes or damp boxes, and we can keep this clay there where it's going to stay damp and workable week to week, and we won't need to start things really drying out until we're all ready for those things to be bisque fired, which is the first step in the firing process. I feel like I'm pretty close to done with this, but I can tell I've annoyed myself with that little bit of extra water that was my bane this example here. So learn from Justin and his extra water mistake. I just need a teeny tiny bit. So of course I want to go around again and make this look really nice. But one thing to note about clay, and once it's glazed, how it interacts. So a smooth surface on clay usually doesn't, you get the beauty of the glaze on that surface, but you will have just a kind of the look of that glaze. Whereas if you have a texture, that glaze, when it's in that kiln at 2,000 plus degrees and all those chemicals in the glaze, those minerals are melted and essentially turning to glass, and a colored glass that makes that hard, food safe texture. When there's a little bit of flow to them, and gravity does have a slight pull or sag on them. And so as that firing is happening, when that glaze hits an edge, it creates a different texture, or a different look, where the glaze kind of breaks a little bit. And so you can sometimes use that, created carving to make a glaze stand out a little more. And so here I've got a little movie magic with another one that I made that doesn't have the sagging bottom as much. Essentially, it's the exact same thing. So the goal of this project is we're going to make 2 of these tea bowls. We'll get the forms all created before we jump into any decorating. And then when we move on to the teapot, the project begins the exact same way, but with a bigger rectangle that holds a little more water. We're still going to attach a bottom to it. Then we've got another step where we attach basically a ring that's going to keep the lid on. And here I'm learning, obviously, where my frame is, and it's the nice edge of that banding wheel. You can see the foot there, really, that gives the tea bowl that floating texture. But I'm excited to see you all. Thanks for watching.